Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 176. The title is All Your Accounts Belong to Us, IDPs Under Attack. Our guest today is Alex Weinert, Chief Product Officer at Semperis. Welcome, Alex.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
So before we dive into the topic today, Alex, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your career trajectory. How'd you get here?
All right. Well, I'm an old dude, so there's a story. I actually started off as a kid, just as a hacker, learning about security through early, hacking to news servers and dialing people up on modems with war dialers and stuff like way back. And then when I was getting my computer science degree, there was a point at which I needed to I was trying to get some insight into a project I was working on. And I knew that Microsoft had solved this problem. So I thought I would try to hack in and look at the source code. And so I did this whole scan for FTP servers, and I was doing research on the web. And so at the same time, I was scanning ports for FTP ports. I started scanning for port 80 and 8080 and found this experimental web server that was like a skunkworks project under a guy's desk. And the person whose desk it was under later became a friend of mine and my boss at one point at Microsoft. But in that process, there was a link to resumes, and I was just obnoxious and in my early 20s and typed up sort of a scathing attack on Microsoft and submitted it as a resume. I was like, you guys don't get it. You're and I was a very Linuxy, anti Microsoft guy. And they called me up and the next morning I thought I was going to get arrested. And they were like, oh no, you should, come in an interview. Sort of long story short, I went and I was very, very impressed with the people I met and started at Microsoft in 95, working in identity. Right away, doing the identity layer for MSN networks, and we built an LDAP server and kind of a precursor to AD there as a developer. And then in my career, did a bunch of identity work, kind of going short. That included the Xbox identity strategy for Xbox One, and in that process, got very involved in fighting crime in the ecosystem. We had a lot of fraud and a lot of criminal activity. And, I've always become sort of with a hacker's mindset from my youth and started working in creating some countermeasures in terms of policy, like the MFA policy for Xbox was one that I kind of brought to the table, some of the early detection work we did there. And no good deed goes unpunished. So I was asked to take on consumer security for the identity stack. And that went pretty well. We introduced some of the early machine learning work in that space and a deeper expansion of strong credentials and recovery technologies and that sort of thing. And then from there, was asked to take on enterprise as well. So the team expanded. So we started this little team in 2012 for identity security in the consumer space, and that expanded out over time to be consumer plus enterprise. And then eventually, sort of organically out of that, built an incident response team for identity, an investigations team for identity, pen testing, red teaming, all for Microsoft's identity stack. So we ended up owning, I was the VP for identity security, and we owned soup to nuts identity security for Microsoft. That led us to crazy things like, the SolarWinds investigation, the Storm 558 investigation, a lot of the really big nation state activity that Microsoft went through in the last, several years, my team was involved in. Remains involved in. But in the end of 2024, I decided to resign my role. I'd been doing it for a long time. I've been 12 years doing it. And I had some really strong leaders that I wanted to get out of their way and see what they would do differently. There's a point at which my influence and my way of thinking about the problem was pretty well imprinted on the team, right? And the value of getting new thinking into that space was probably going to be higher than whatever kind of regurgitation of my principles I would reassert, right? So I thought I was going to get out of identity security, and I just failed at it. I got really excited about, the idea of having a radical career change, or maybe, just going off and, sitting in the sun somewhere. But But while I was gone, there were all these, stories that kept kind of crossing my path about various attacks on identity infrastructure and the subsequent damage, societal damage and risk to various populations, including vulnerable populations. And I was like, I don't think I'm ready to, I don't think we're done. We're certainly not done with identity security. Like, we haven't solved this problem. And I don't think that I was done. Like, I wanted to keep going. And I was friends with Mickey at Semperis, and he and I talked. And the idea of going to a really small company that's laser focused on solving the problem for the customer was appealing. So I switched careers at that point. And that was kind of chapter 3. So like chapter 1 was my hacker era. Chapter 2 my 30 years at Microsoft, and probably the most important part of that was building and running the identity security team for Microsoft until 2024, and then in 2025 taking a sabbatical in which I realized I wasn't ready to stop, and joining up with Semperis in what is a very focused play on really thinking about identity infrastructure and how do we protect that. So yeah, that's what got me here today.
So I was looking at Semperis actually has a pretty broad suite of products that are related, but there's a product for AD threat detection and response, a product for cyber first, AD disaster recovery, attack pattern detection, online identity security posture assessment, security first, AD migration and consolidation, backup and recovery for entry ID resources, hybrid AD security assessment. So it's actually a lot of products. A lot of sort of specific products. How do you think about that? Or like, what as a product manager, why is that the right strategy to have sort of each individual laser focus?
Well, I think as chief of product, what you're going to see a lot more is cross-pollination and consolidation into a cohesive platform. But if you look at those tools today, they're telling a story about like what it means to do identity resilience, right? And identity resilience is not something that like you can say, well, I detect a password spray attack, I've done identity resilience, right? You have to think in terms of like, there's really, we talk a lot about 3 phases. Right? There's before the attack happens, what are you doing to harden the environment, reduce your risk, like, eliminate attack paths into the tier 0 environment, address vulnerabilities in the environment, all the kinds of posture management things you need to do to get set up, right? Like during the attack, you want to be able to detect and then disrupt attacks. So like things like containment, rollback, challenges, all that kind of stuff that happens is super critical. But the fantasy that says no attack ever gets through, right, is a it's a nice dream, but detections are not perfect, responses are not perfect, and so the next thing is, well, what happens if an attack penetrates? And in that world, you need to have the preparation to say, okay, I've got my backups, I got the ability to recover. If it's like a ransomware attack, I understand what my playbook is, I know how to get in touch with people. So there's kind of 2 pieces to that. One is the identity resilience piece around like having backups and recovery. And then the other piece of that is actually having an environment to run that recovery in, which is the crisis management platform. And the reason that we're on all those places is largely because, and a lot of this precedes me, right? So like, I don't get to claim credit, but I think it's cool, is that as the company offered these capabilities, right, especially around recovery, when do you meet somebody in a recovery situation? Well, they've probably been ransomwared, right? So if you go into a company that's been ransomwared, it's chaos, right? Like things are not good. Like you probably can't get into the building because your key cards are like locked into your Active Directory environment. The attacker has probably left persistence mechanisms in accounts and group memberships and privileges that are in the system. There might be malware on the servers that was actually the point of entry for the attacker, or other network vulnerabilities, reports that were left open. Like there's a ton of stuff going on in that situation. And so we had one of the things that differentiates them versus very, very deep identity experience, right? Like it's a magnet for identity experts. And so people would come into these situations and we'd offer help. We'd be like, okay, like we can help you figure out what's going on with your GPO, or what's going on with your conditional access policy, or, what were the penetration points. And through that, it was like, hey, we need a tool to help people figure this out. Like not just the very smart humans that were available, on these incident response calls, but that then turns into, hey, like, initially for ourselves, for our own people, to say, when I go into this environment, I need a tool to do this assessment more quickly, and then you turn that into a product for customer. So that's kind of how the current constellation of tools evolved. But where we're shifting to, and rapidly, is really thinking in terms of a suite, like much more cohesive set of capabilities, and that reduces a lot of things. But one of the parts is that I would assert that deep identity expertise is actually hard to come by. Like, you and I are like identity nerds, and we like, you have sort of the identity world out there where there's people who've gotten into this because they early on figured out that identity was the gatekeeper for everything we were doing, right? Like, in some sense, you can go back to when I was like hacking passwords as a 12-year-old. It was like early understanding of like the power of identity, right? But in terms of like deep expertise, in terms of what does it mean for these complex and kind of ever self-complicating systems to really be run well, I think the fact is that like finding somebody who's a really great AD person is not that easy. It's not like that's where the training is now and that's where the focus is now, but that is still where the infrastructure sits, right? So one of our obligations, I think, really as an industry, right, not just in Sempros, but really in the industry, is to start thinking about how do you sort of decomplicate these environments, at least at an operational level and especially in a security level. Like, it cannot be the case that you need a PhD in like identity and you have to like have a, like friends like Eve Mailer or Pam Dingle on the phone to like help you through the complexities of, your token construction. Like, that's not reality for the vast majority of people out there. Like, we as an industry, we need to bring it down to like a lot more self-maintaining systems, right? And so when we think about like what are the steps you need to take to ensure that your identity infrastructure, which is so critical, is actually resilient, that's a place where we don't want to actually ask people to say, well, you figure out which tool to use. Like, we want to guide you through that and reduce that cognitive burden quite a bit.
A lot of these tools mention AD specifically, and there's been this trend of moving towards the cloud to Entra ID. And yet we still hear all of these connections to AD, like your security cards or your Wi-Fi or other legacy applications. At what point does AD go away? And do we have to stop dealing with holes in AD?
Yeah, I worked for Entra. Like, when we picked up the enterprise security thing, we brought the consumer and enterprise teams together. And that was, I think, 2014. So for about 10 years, I worked in Entra, and like the rallying cry to every customer is always like, hey, get rid of AD. Like, you got to shift to the cloud. It's safer in the cloud. I believe these things are true. Actually, it's safer. Management burden is lower. Our ability in the cloud to adapt to attacks and to provide better resilience, all that stuff is better. Like, there's no real question about it. And I think the net costs are better for cloud deployments of identity. So I don't regret ever saying that. The reality on the ground, though, is that we don't have identity systems. Like, we don't switch from identity system to identity system because, like, you don't go from I'm an Active Directory person to I'm an ADFS person to I'm an ADFS, Entra person. Like, and then like I'm only Entra and I'm only Okta. Like, that's not actually how the world works, right? Because what happens is that every one of these stages, you add applications, and applications, ultimately the productivity applications or the operational applications are things like OT, where you're actually running a factory floor with like big machines that are scary, picking up and moving things, like a manufacturing plant or whatever. Each of these things those applications are built and they become literally, the heart and soul of how a business is run, how it produces its value. And it has some authentication strategy along with it. And so if we go back far enough in time, we say, we have applications. That's kind of a cool idea. But all networks are isolated in the early days, like before the internet. And like, I'm old enough that I remember when communication between computer systems was like novel. But before then, you would stand up a system in an environment and like, what are you worrying about auth for? Like, the only thing in that environment is that system, right? So there's no auth. And then you go and you have some number of these things that literally still exist. And then you go up into like mainframes and you have, simple password rules or whatever, but there's no ability to do single sign-on. And there's a horde of these apps. And in fact, most of the service-to-service communication we have in the world still functions this way, right? Like, most apps that work out there some developer coded up a thing and it says, I'll go to this INI file and figure out what my password is. And then when you want to call my app, you got to pass the password. Like the service to service, the non-human identity stuff, like actually has a huge non-single sign-on element. Like the majority of
a lot of shared secrets.
Yeah, a lot of shared secrets. Like it's all, you think, what is a cert? It's a shared secret. What's a key? Shared secret. Passwords, shared secrets. Like some systems will use service accounts. Many systems use user accounts. Like the easiest thing for a developer to do is just say, I'm just use my credentials and work under my own privilege. And so those things exist. And then you, of course, the person retires, but you can't get rid of the account, right? So now that account exists forever. But there's service principles and in a perfect world, managed identities, which are probably the most secure thing you can do today. But all of those technologies, kind of to my point, they're evolving over time. The apps don't go away. That's the main thing to understand. Like if you're a bank, you're still probably using Swift, and it's still not single sign-on. In fact, it's still a limited password and not single sign-on, right? If you're using a mainframe application, you're still in this world. And there's a lot of things that go along with that. But one thing that happens is once you start to use Curb, right? Kerberos, like a la 1992 or whatever, right? Yeah. Once you start, or 90, 2000, year 2000, if you're talking about AD, right? What's happening is you have a lot of applications that are being built now to use this new applications or a new authentication standard. People are super excited about it, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I'm building my app to use Curb. Like now I have single sign-on, like yay, right? And that's cool. And all those apps get built. And you have tons and tons of value embedded in those apps, and your business starts to weave itself into the existence of those apps, and that app becomes the truth of how you do business. Then along comes somebody's like, hey, no, check out SAML. SAML's cool. Do SAML instead. SAML's better than Curb. Like, hey, we got these cloud apps. We got Salesforce out here. You got to be able to connect. Like, go to SAML. Everybody switch to SAML. So we do ADFS at Microsoft. There's Bing Identity. There's Ping Federate. There's I think y'all are doing like Federation. Like everybody has this ability to do Federation, and that's great. And so now we have new SAML apps, and like they're kicking along. But what happened to the Curb apps? They didn't all get rewritten, right? They're still there. So the idea that I'm going to switch. Like I'm just going to switch is crazy. What actually happens is I add a layer to the onion. So I have my Active Directory stuff still present in like 95% of accounts, right? Of identity accounts for Microsoft, right? Because it's not the identity system that's hard to get rid of. It's the application that depends on the identity system. So SAML comes along. We build all these apps for SAML, and then we're like, oh, OAuth is cool. Let's use that. It's got some advantages. You know what? You're still using SAML. And you're using OAuth, right? And then we're going to add some other stuff in. Let's go like add in, verifiable credentials, right? And say we want to do some additions. Like that's great, new technology, new capabilities. You didn't get rid of AD. You just added another layer, right? And that's the reality that I think. And I'm not even getting into like mergers and acquisitions, right? Where you're actually bringing in whole other identity subsystems, and SIAM, where you've got like you're trying to integrate your enterprise identity stuff with the way you talk to your customers, and B2B, where you like got to figure out your federation. Like all these things add more and more systems and complexity and policy to the situation, right? And each of those points of interface is a place where an attacker can go, oh, I see how you're syncing your accounts from like your 25-year-old on-premises, or better yet, I'm seeing how the company that you just bought and brought into your environment and federated into your forest actually syncs their accounts into Entra as global administrators. Let me just go modify the membership in that distribution group, and now I actually have an account as a global administrator. Like attackers understand the weave, what we call the identity fabric, like the weave of all these different identity components working together to create access, but also to like expose opportunities. And if I want to take out your system, I don't have to take out every component in your system. I can take out one piece of it for either security or for denial of service, right? If I understand how those policies come together. So this is the real problem for our customers today, like is that they are dealing with a very complex environment that is being preferentially attacked. We know that like 80% of breaches now are starting in identity, and that the preference to attack the infrastructure itself is, kind of on an exponential curve, led by guys like SolarWinds, right? The SolarWinds attack, where they came after the Federation services as a way to get access, modified application permissions as a way to persist, right? So now we're in this world where this is the reality is people have these very complex systems. a lot of technology that nobody knows how it really runs anymore. You just kind of like, don't touch it. It doesn't want to fall over, layered over newer stuff. Right. And, the recon game is go figure out how all that stuff works together and then figure out which component you want to attack. The defense game is you have to understand how all of it works together and make sure all of it is resilient. Right. And that's kind of a super fun and challenging problem to be part of solving. Right.
Well, a lot of that resonated with me. Glue is a federation platform, and we still have this connector called a Spinago. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Maybe as a Microsoft person, you can. What's the correct pronunciation of that? You know what I'm talking about?
Spinago?
SPNGO. It's basically a web interface connector to Kerberos.
Yeah.
That enables you, because we always get this request where customers say, well, I'm already logged into my Windows workstation. When I boot my browser, it should just know who I am.
Right.
And there's a connection layer for that.
Yeah.
And I always joke about how, well, is it really that much work, for me to present my credentials and to keep it, separate from my Windows login? It's like, how much work did I actually save compared to how much risk and integration complexity I just added to this application? But we still support it at Glue because there's some customers who they expect it to work that way.
Yeah.
And sometimes like the customers, if it's their risk. So if they want to, take the risk and do the work, who are we to say no?
Yeah. I'm giving a talk actually at Identiverse, which is like a thought exercise around this, which I was working in Mexico, and I was talking to some, partners there that deliver services for multiple customers. Right. And the stat that one of the partners said was that 60% of their customers don't do single sign-on. 60%. Right. And so I was like, man, that's actually a really tough sell. Like if you're an identity resilience, identity security company, one of your opening lines is going to be like, hey, this is the most attacked thing in the environment, and an attack on identity brings the whole business to its knees. And like, if the identity is down, then everything is down, right? And that's all true in a single sign-on environment. So if you don't have a single sign-on environment and somebody tells you that, the last thing in the world you're going to want to do is go like deploy a single sign-on technology, right? You're going to be like, no, I like having a different password for every app. Thank you very much, right? Because at least I know that breach of one is just breach of one. It's not breach of all. And I think that
I've heard that argument before. I don't want to tie everything together because then I'll be vulnerable. Normally, it's not a good argument because you just increase your attack surface area in terms of what can be attacked. And I think SSOs normally it is a good idea.
I think it's also absolutely a good idea, but it's also a really interesting, it's an interesting argument to counter. And it's also interesting, I think, again, as a challenge to us in the industry of how do we create the firewalls and the compartmentalization between these systems so that you can have the benefits of SSO without having the full systemic compromise problem that you get if you lose the identity underpinning, right?
Right. I wanted to relate this back. You were really going in this direction. I just wanted to make sure that we relate back to the title of the episode. But the direction it sounded like we're going in here is that the old stuff never goes away. There's still Kerberos, there's still SAML. The applications never get updated, or even if they do get updated, it takes a while. And there can be a really long tail, which might be your entire career.
Right.
As an identity person. And that the new stuff actually, the cloud identity is good because apps are generally moving to the cloud, and we need more sort of economies of scale. I think from a compliance standpoint, it's really hard to not do SSO these days, because if you want to be SOC 2 or ISO 27K, then their first task is going through all your apps and making sure you use the IDP that you've certified to log into all of them. So the IDP is becoming this huge attack surface area, and we've seen the rise of ITDR tools, identity threat detection and response tools. For example, in episode 92, we had a episode with Mark Batchelor and Amy D'Souza talking about the Veracent platform, which is takes your IDP logs
Mhm.
and tries to put them into a database that can detect threats and give you some cool visualizations.
Awesome.
Um, but why? But maybe let's take a step back. What does the threat landscape look like for the IDP, assuming that the enterprise is going in this direction? Like, what does the threat landscape really look like today? If you made that decision to consolidate
Sure.
on an IDP.
Well, I think to your point, like, and if you haven't, you probably should, right? Like, single sign-on is actually, you know, net positive. I think the question of how do you manage the risks is the next one, right? Which kind of gets us to this. I think that I mean, we had some malware. NotPetya being a great example that like would impact identity systems and cause huge problems. The first time I saw really like well done exploitation of the connective tissue between identity systems was when we did this the SolarWinds investigation. So, and the SolarWinds, like, it's an easy moniker. We all think of it as SolarWinds, but the majority of the attack did not involve SolarWinds. Like, the majority of what the actors did, the common threads were primarily federation and application permissions. And so, like, we back this up. Like, what was going on was the nation state actor or advanced persistent threat actor, which I think we now call Midnight Blizzard, was attempting to get access to email from various federal organizations, right? And so the way they wanted to, and these were hosted in Microsoft's online email services, right? And so the common end goal for them was to get to where they could run queries against these email systems. And they had a specific query pattern that they used. And that query pattern was what we ended up doing to kind of reverse engineer where they were, like what were all the accounts they were touching and who are they bothering, because they had some uniqueness in that query. That query didn't show up normally. And so once you found the query, then you can start working backwards to figure out how did they get the ability to do the query, right? And basically in every case there, what they were doing was using credentials for an application that they had either placed or discovered. And they were acting as the application to query the mail system, right? And this works really well because if you have, say, a system that's doing compliance checking against your mail server, right, or your mail content, then it's doing large volumes of reads anyway, right? And so they could then insert their reads into that large volume of reads, and it wasn't really noticeable to anybody, right? Unless you knew exactly what they were looking for. So once we figured out what query they were using and we were able to reverse engineer that, we found all the people. So then you go backwards and say, okay, how do they get access to it? Well, they did it with an application where they, in some cases, created a false application in the system, and then placed their own private key, public key pair in place to go get access. In other cases, and this is, you go in and you grant permissions. You say, I want directory read, mail.read or whatever. In other cases, they found an app that already had those permissions and then just added their own. Applications can have multiple credentials in Entra. So they would add their own credential that sat alongside the legitimate credential. They could authenticate as though they were the application, again, do those queries. So how'd they do that? Well, that requires admin permissions. So they're an admin in the Entra environment. So how'd they get admin in Entra? Well, the way they get admin in Entra, we follow that chain. And it's like, okay, well, what they did is one of two things. They either authenticated into Entra with a ADFS or Ping Federator or whatever, with a federation token, right? So they're saying, okay, I need, Entra has designated the federation server as the IDP, right? So any request to Entra is going to bounce and require a token from the federation server, right? And in that world, what they were doing was they were taking the signing key from the federation server, right? And they were signing tokens. They were generating tokens that you could respond to, but there was never the bounce. There was never the request and come back and go get a token from the federation server. They would just come with a valid token, right? So how are they synthesizing these tokens? Well, they had the signing keys, right? How'd they get the signing keys? Well, That's where SolarWinds comes in. In some of the cases, what happens is the SolarWinds network software got them a system admin on the box, and they could just reach into the storage, extract the storage files for the signing keys, extract the signing keys, and then use those to generate requests. In other cases, later, after many customers moved to HSM, what they did is they actually went in and with the same access, they were able to process wrap the Federation servers. Right. So even if the Federation server was calling back to an HSM to do the signing, they would actually have control of the process because they were wrapping the process. So like the process was calling with its legitimate, identity. So in each of these cases, what you're seeing is like they're now like they're going back across these layers. They're crossing the Federation layer now to get access. They're crossing the application layer to get access into the mail. All they want is mail access. So you go back how they get into those systems. Well, where they had SolarWinds, obviously that was the thing. In other cases, they hacked people that were service providers. So there were organizations that had like thousands of customers that lost administrative control of their environments. How did that happen? Well, mostly that happened through password spray. Like the most common penetration mechanism for all of these attacks was actually password spray. So really mundane, right? Like I get into one account with password spray. I move laterally. I get to an admin account. And then this is the second major mechanism. I don't use Federation. The other thing I can do is I can just add myself to a group or make sure I know what the members of the administrative groups are, and then like move them across. So this is the reality of these attacks. Well, that attack was very public. Like that was in the news and like everybody hears about it and we write papers about it and red teams go off and like build tools for it, right? So that we get like, really, really cool tools that help red teams go and simulate the exact same attacks. And those go up into GitHub. Other people download them. They turn them into weaponized versions of those tools. And so now the sophisticated attacks that was developed by probably hundreds or thousands of people working in Russia on the Midnight Blizzard group, right, is now something that's like commodity available to script kiddies. So we now have that. So that's kind of the one major thing. The other major thing, what I'll be kind of briefer on, is that identity is really effective at securing organizations. Like single sign-on has actually been super effective when you combine it with tools like conditional access or tools like GPO, where you're like regulating, you have visibility, you can see what all the traffic is because you can see how the authentications are working. You can detect anomalies in those authentications. You can challenge, you can use MFA, like all that stuff is great. It got so good that it was easier to like try to undermine the system than it was to defeat it. So like if I wanted to get access to an important resource, it might be hard for me to get onto a managed device with a strong auth token, which is non-anomalous in terms of its location and where it's coming from. That's hard to do. But what's actually easier to do at some level, it may be to say, let me just go and like, subvert the entire system by getting access to the signing key. Right. And now I don't have to do all that other crap. I'll just generate the token I want and come in and get it. Right. So that's where we see that shift where people are not attacking individual accounts to get some subset of data. They attack the infrastructure and they get all the data. They get everything they want. Right. So that's why that shift is happening.
Yeah. As soon as you got to the point of they stole the private keys of the IDP and were issuing their own tokens, you're at the point of a total compromise in a worst case scenario.
Yeah. So I wrote the briefing for our executive, for like Microsoft's executive team, because as soon as this thing broke, we had to go and brief them every night. So I wrote the initial briefing, and it was the first time I'd ever written, having successfully gained full administrative control of both the on-premises and cloud environments, the attack begins, right? Like their starting point was admin control of both sides, right? Mm-hmm. And then they start to actually manipulate the application permissions and all the other things they did. But they had, these were pervasive compromises and extremely hard to recover from.
One of the challenges with this kind of data is that it can be a fire hose of data. Actually, the authentication tools have emerged around ITDR, which is primarily logs from the IDP. But when you factor in decision logs, so if we're going to centralize policy management and get a record of every policy decision, that creates exponentially more data about what's happening. So it's good, but it's also a fire hose of data. And it's how do you actually find the signal from the noise to detect that SolarWinds attack, the next SolarWinds attack?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the other thing about the SolarWinds attack, if you look at how it was detected, what was actually detected was strong auth tokens existed for which the MFA system had done no transaction. That was the log discrepancy that they found. There was a policy that required strong auth for users, and this is sort of the patient zero thing. They were using, I believe it was Duo for MFA, and they found the strong auth token. They went to find the correlated Duo authentication to find the MFA grant, and it didn't exist. That never happened. So that was your proof that okay, that's a synthetic token, right? So that correlation between systems was critical in that situation. It's very rare, right? Most people are doing analytics on okay, here's the logs from just Entra or from just AD or from whatever. But that ability to look across systems like you're talking about and actually understand the policy intersections of those systems, that's magical. I don't worry too much about the volume of data, because I think that between supervised machine learning, unsupervised machine learning, and now sort of agentic inspection, you can process a lot of data fast. I don't worry too much about the volume of data from an understanding perspective. And anomaly detection in systems generally benefits from having more data. The more normal traffic you have, the easier it is to detect differentiations from normal. But I think that the net of this pivot to more automated, inspectable policy and more of a focus on the fabric of identity rather than the individual components, I think that will net out positive for defenders, because frankly, the attackers are already there. They're all doing it. They understand that the gaps are, it's like a good jazz musician. You don't play the notes, you play between the notes, right? And these guys are playing between the systems, and they're having a lot of effectiveness doing it. Defenders have to go to the same place. We have to get into that fabric.
So one of the challenges that I see is that with the knowledge of how an attack happened, we can feed that into machine learning and try and detect similar attacks. But actually detecting novel anomalous activity is very difficult. And I see this as related to the agentic AI problem, because people say, well, we can't just write the rules for agentic AI because an AI agent could do anything. Who knows? We can't constrain it to all the things we could possibly imagine. So our only option is to sort of look at the behavior of the agent and try and say, no, this is outside the bound somehow. But I guess my question is, do we need to work backwards from known attacks? Is that the only way? And how do we use machine learning when we don't really know what we're looking for in this massive wave of data?
Yeah, so I sort of disagree on principle with a couple of statements there. So
Sure.
Go attack them. The first one is that so if we think about agentic, right? Agentic is going to be what agentic is going to do to hurt us is it's going to insert a lot of non-deterministic behavior into a system that we're not used to having it for, right? Humans move slowly and with some predictability. And we've mostly built our anomaly detection around the ideas that humans do weird things. And the reason for that is that most of the rest of our systems are code. And so, applications outnumber humans about 20 to 1 in terms of identity today, right? That'll jump, I think, to 100 to 200 to 1 as we see agentic applications and low code, no code systems coming up. So what does that do? Well, first of all, the average application has 95% more, or is not using 95% of the permissions that's been granted, right? Applications are typically written with full God permissions and then use a small subset of that to do their job. So if you look at deployed applications, 80% are unused entirely. They've been abandoned but not decommissioned. 95% of the permissions that they have are unused. So this is a massive.
Just to give a real example, a lot of applications have root access to the database they're querying.
Right. And then they're going to go query for a phone number for read access. They need read phone number from the thing, and they have root. They have, or another example is if I have directory read write all for an application that needs to look up the gal. And unfortunately, these are not made up examples. They're big, impactful problems that attackers have now gravitated to. They're going, whoa, why would I mess with a user who has some shrimpy little permission that's whatever? And like I was describing the SolarWinds attack, when I can go to the application and get full permissions for everything, right? And nobody's paying attention. I hate to say it, but largely nobody's paying attention to the applications. because you kind of think of them as, well, it runs. Like, I won't go hands off. Again, it's central to my business. It runs. Let's leave it alone. The behavior of those applications is pretty deterministic. And the good news in this sort of horror story is that the applications, even though they're massively over permissioned, they don't use those permissions, right? Because they're coded to just do the thing they do. Now enter agentic. You do the same thing and you say, hey, go and let me go write my agent. And coding is hard and getting things working is hard. And I keep bumping into permissions problems. So screw it. I'm just going to ask for all the permissions. But this is an agent, right? So it's going to go and figure out what it can do, right? And depending on the prompts it's getting and the objectives it has, it will find new pathways to the system to go do what it needs to do. It will share data with other agents, right? And so now, instead of having this thing where we're 20-to-1 applications to users, but the applications, despite being over permissioned, are constrained in what they do. Now we're in a situation where we're 200-to-1 applications to users, and the applications, most of them, are non-constrained in what they can do. But they probably have the same kind of permissions because the humans that are deploying them have the same fallibility, which is that upfront investment in strict governance and strict controls and strict policy is not conducive to, like, oh, I got to get my application working and it was due last Thursday and it's late, right? So that problem, that sort of anthropological problem, that who humans are and what we do under organizational pressure, combined with the randomness essentially of agentic and the over-permissioning, that's going to be a gnarly problem. And if you were ever thinking about getting like your policies locked down and the permissions locked down, now is the time, right? Like, you got to get, like, because whatever I can do in the organization, I might not know all the things I have access to. I might not know I have the, access to the secret formula and to the financials data that's going to be, whatever, but my agent sure will. My agent will. And it's going to go find all that stuff and it's going to go expose that stuff. And so it's important that your users are restricted in what they have access to, because the agents acting on their behalf will exploit all of the access they have.
Awesome. Well, I wish we had time for more. I have follow-up questions on that. I would love to get into Cedar and reasoning over, but we're just not going to have time. So in the interest of giving you the last few minutes to just cover what Semperis is up to, next steps, or anything else you want to talk about. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all like, the chances are, if people are watching this, these are, you're an identity professional, right? You're either a system architect or you're building one of these systems. If you're, spending your free time watching a thing on identity, and so I think that we have an opportunity, I think, as an industry to respond to all this stuff. It is a time when, the identity systems are more important than ever. This is not a place where we're going to say, well, now agentic is here, so we can stop investing in identity security. It's very much the opposite, right? We're going to have more identities to manage. There's a stronger imperative for governance. It is more important than ever to understand the attack paths, get those things discovered. Agentic and agents and generative can play a role in helping you with all that discovery and all that lockdown. But the rigor that we apply to these systems today will be essential, because we've already seen, we just recently saw in Mexico, there was an attack using a couple of agentic, I believe there were Claude agents that were convinced to break their rules, that exfiltrated like 150 gigabytes of citizen data from the Mexican government. So these attacks are starting. They're going to move fast. Our ability to deal with them, the starting point for that is strict elimination of rogue apps, elimination of permission from applications, elimination of unnecessary user permissions. Like, all that stuff is going to be super critical. Semperis is, for a few words on Semperis, Semperis is very committed to this mission, the mission of identity security, and specifically of infrastructure security, and pulling together the solutions that help with that. I'm not going to go pitch product right now, but I think that certainly we're very open to conversations about how to approach it in your environment. And again, just a critical time to get ready, because it's coming fast.
Awesome. So I just want to ask the audience, if you're enjoying the show or at least finding it useful, please follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn or YouTube, or comment on some of the episodes. The next episode is on post-quantum cryptography and sort of the intersection of IAM, how it will impact us. We'll have a guest engineer from WSO2. Oh no, I have the wrong. I got the. Sorry, Alex. Let me get this out of here.
We'll do
Alex
another
is currently on the episode, not on the next episode. It's supposed to be like that. Next episode, post-quantum cryptography. But if you made it this far, like I said, something different goes wrong on every episode. So par for the course. So with that, also I'd just like to remind you that there's episode notes on GitHub, glue.co/IOH- the episode number, which in this case is 176. Alex had some good reading. And I put a link into episode 92 about the ITDR episode. Anyway, with that, I will say thank you, Alex. Thank you, audience. And we'll see you next time.